we need to look a little bit from the supply chain because I think the value is not only to the customers of the suppliers, but the supply chain themselves. How do you see the value being there when they have a standard, an agreed upon standard by the industry on how to exchange information? So, Andy, do you want to take this one first?
Sure, sure. Perhaps I can start anecdotally from experience in managing supply chains. In my role in managing supply chains was around cybersecurity and privacy, right? And what you have essentially is supply chains with the providers within those supply chains are often in different geographies, subject to different jurisdictions, different rules and regulations, and so on, which may be quite different from yours, right? So having being in that chain can be very challenging for a supplier because they may have customers from all over the world that they're trying to service with a particular product or particular material they're trying to provide or whatever. And trying to answer customer requests about ESG from all over the world quite separately without any common framework is just a time challenge in itself. Secondly, it's a knowledge and understanding challenge because you can have data and metrics, but without the context of what's being asked, it's very difficult to provide the right answers. So knowing that, having a global framework to do that is really beneficial for suppliers themselves because they'll end up doing one report or perhaps a report for a particular industry they serve, right? With very marginal customization for a specific customer, rather than each request being completely different. And then, of course, that's in the context of one customer to one supplier. Compound that through the supply chain, you can easily see how much time, effort, resources is being wasted in that process, but also where the understanding breaks down along that supply chain, right? About who's asking for what, at what point in time, in what context is very difficult. So having a actionable ESG framework is really important, not just for businesses, as we discussed before, but just with the whole process of managing throughout the supply chain.
So thank you, Andy. And Jacques, maybe to add to the question on how the supply chain works, I want to basically notice or note that many times people are, or executives are telling us, oh, we are in Latin America, we are in Chile or in Mexico. What do we have to do is European market? Why do we need to do sustainability for the European market or the Asian market? Or why, if we are in the US and we removing some of the sustainability requirements, why should they comply with the rest of the world?
Well,
Jacques,
well, it's at the end, your product is going to become part of another product that's going to be part of a product that's going to be sold in this particular country. So somebody is going to need the information to aggregate it into their own supply chain report to see if they meet the requirements of that country. That's one of the key points that people sometimes don't realize, that a product is when you sell your component to somebody, even in your own country, then after that, it goes somewhere else. Okay, it's very, maybe unless you're in the food industry that everything stays in your local area, most of the stuff travels all over the world right now. So at the end, this is what is becoming important. And that's also one of the reasons why having different requirements on a per country basis, especially if they don't even look at all the same, is going to be extremely complicated for the industry. And standards can help unifying those types of things as well, where countries could have their own little special requirements. That's fine, but at least the core of it is kind of common.
And you know, one comment based on today's reality, right? We didn't expect eggs to become an export item, and suddenly they are. So
Yeah.
eggs exported to the US have to comply with US health regulation as opposed to European regulations or Latin American regulations. So
Yeah.
this is an example that of the fluidity, if you want. Maybe you can comment on that, of those elements.
Mm.
They are fluid, right? They are not cast in stone. The supply chains keep moving all the time.
Yeah, for all kinds of reasons. It could be a disaster in a country. It could be some geopolitical uncertainty. There's a, you know, we saw with the pandemic that all of a sudden the supply chain got completely disrupted. So the supply chain is it's alive, okay? And if somebody finds a new supplier in another country that provides you, you know, cheaper, better, or with something that adds value to your own products, you're gonna go there. So that's the part that that's one of the reasons why all of this thing is so. It's a movable part. You cannot just rely on certain things. I said I did it 5 years ago. It's still valid today. Now everything changes all the time.
So
That's a really good point. The whole supply chain is very dynamic. So that just reinforces the fact having a common framework. So even if that supply chain changes over time, you're still managing along the same information.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would add is when you look at a lot of regulations now, they're getting quite specific. If you do business in this country or region, you are subject to this regulation, and so are your suppliers, right?
Yep.
So a lot of this thing is being cascaded from different regions to other regions for applicability, right? So you end up with a global dynamic network of different regulations and so on. So if you're sat in the US, you will find your product or service being used around the world, even though you may not be 100% aware of it at that time. Your product may get built into some other package or service. So again, those dynamics along the supply chain is just more reinforcement of we need a common language and framework around those transactions.
Thank you, Andy and Jacques. Actually, absolutely, you need some. If you want to have fluidity, flexibility in data, you need a framework that doesn't, you know, tendencies the weight, so to speak. It has to be stable. It has to be usable for a long time.
Yep.
And just one other point I'd like to make is, as we put this together, we've talked about the applicability of AI, right? To use that as a tool to apply this framework, right, and this standard. When you look at AI, you need common understanding. You need context. It's not just data bits. You need the context in which that's being asked. And when you look at AI implementations, it's all about having high quality data in the right context with the proper prompt engineering to make sure you get a quality answer in the context in which you asked it and so on, right? So again, AI is just taking off as a business tool, and without a common standard around and the SG, an actionable ESG framework, we're missing a great opportunity there, right? So putting this in place will not only make it amenable to AI, it'll really increase the business value to a lot of our customers and
Thank you for
partners.
bringing the prompt engineering actually, because AI answers to whatever question you ask. If you ask a slightly different question, you may get a totally different answer from AI.
Absolutely.
So that's another reason we need a standard above the actually data to tell tell prompt engineers what is the context, what kind of information you are trying to or insights you are trying to extract from AI. So that's. But actually, we had a sort of a mini uh, business case or a mini case study for thinking of supply chains and eggs. But I'll bring another question maybe. In case of supply chains, there are a couple of elements that customers cannot do it alone. You brought, Andy, the idea of car manufacturer and tires. The carbon footprint, for instance, is primarily dictated by the supply chain. The waste elimination program cannot be done in isolation, right? Because each point, each supplier in its process, there's a waste process. So all these have to be streamlined. They have to have, as you both mentioned, a common framework. So how do you see this, Jacques, in the context of a use case for sustainability, for a case study for sustainability? And let's take the waste collection, for instance, as an example.
Well, I think there's going to be some adaptation for each type of industry. Okay, certain waste are pretty much recyclable waste. Some other waste is really toxic waste. So there's different types at the end that you have to take care of. But I expect that if we got some good generic requirements, most of it should apply to all industry. They might just say in the response that this one is not applicable to us and explain why. But there's going to also be certain, I'm expecting that like pretty much all standards, it won't be able to cover 100% of everything. So there's going to be some specific industry specific or even company specific points that are going to have to be addressed in there. But that we don't necessarily, in a standard, you don't necessarily want to take care of 100% of all the possible cases, because that would make your standard impossible to develop and would take so long that it's not even practical. But you want to cover a large percentage of it, like over 95% of the cases. So then everybody that wants to use it can work on the last few percent if they need to adapt it to their own personal requirements. You know, I've seen standards used that I worked on before that are used by very big companies, and the companies basically use most of the standards and add their own requirements on top of it when they send an RFI or an RFQ to their suppliers. So that's a good way for them to also adapt it. You know, the standard is going to give a bottom line. Some of the companies will want to have more than that. Some of the companies, for whatever reason, maybe based on where they are in the world and everything, would want to have a little less than that. And they have to be able to adapt to it, but at least have a strong baseline from which they can work and then adapt it for their own need.
So SRFI has to be both flexible and comprehensive without being overbearing, essentially, basically telling everything and considering every case, I think you're saying, Jacques.
Yeah. Standards are voluntary. They use voluntarily by the industry. So they need, it's not a rule that the government says that those shall follow this. It's kind of something you offer to the industry to say, hey, If you use that, you have a strong basis from which to discuss rather than start from a blank sheet. And that's really the I would say the biggest value of it.
No, thank you. And I'll turn it to Andy in a second, but I want to mention that in telecom, for instance, we have standards about exchanging information on one standard we want to use. I don't want to
Yes.
get too much in technical details, but we need to agree on which video codec standard, video encryption standard we use if we want a video call like today's call to happen. Otherwise, one end will apply a standard, the other end a different standard, and things will not work. So the interoperability is an element in the framework to exchange information, and I'll turn to Andy. How do you see it from your experience?
I'm sorry, to clarify, how do I see what? How do I see
SRFI
it
role,
evolving?
the SRFI role, Sustainable Request for Information Standards role of being both a solid framework of reference, but flexible enough as Jacques
Oh, yeah.
mentioned.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And I think I mentioned at the beginning in some of the introductory comments about how we structured this so that we could take advantage of a common framework, but we could also have industry-specific content and, more importantly, customizable content as well. And it's to Jacques' point, you need that, and it will be accepted and continuously improved over time. But another thought I had was that when we look at how we're going to deploy this within a company may already have various business processes using different frameworks and so on for lots of different transactions. So having that flexibility allows companies to adapt this over time to their existing processes as well. So I think double value there, providing out of the gate that flexibility for anybody wants to apply it in a greenfield situation. But it also allows companies that are very mature in ESG reporting to start taking advantage of some of the commonality there to improve their processes and improve their operations and costs around that reporting.
Thank you, Andy. You brought the issue of transformation, and the challenge of many companies is how to move from the current state to the future state, which includes AI, which includes actually sustainability, which includes changes we talked about the dynamics of the supply chain and the fact that they constantly change. There are regulations, there are tariffs, there are agreements, and so on. So in this fluid environment, the companies have to adapt. And I think, and I'd like your comments on how really, and I think we cover it in part, how SRFI really should offer this flexibility. I think we need to go a little bit more in details. And I'll give you a case study. Again, we've talked about waste. And so let's take one example. Today, every company has a waste reduction program, and the supplier has the waste reduction program. And if you don't have something like SRFI, a common mode to these two programs in isolations may be very inefficient for the other part. So, for instance, carbon footprint, right? Supply may have a very high emission of carbon. The customer gets to transfer to report on this emission of carbon. So if they don't agree, they don't have a common framework to understand. That's going to fall through the cracks, right? So maybe Andy, you have some insights, and Jacques as well, please.
I think we've already sort of touched on these points throughout this discussion generally. So yeah, I mean, just to emphasize, having that same context is very important. I'm trying to think of a good example. There was one I read recently about waste tires in England, in the UK.
Yeah, I think the
And
program UK and how they are shipped and this,
right,
I think in
and
India
the
or
customer,
Asia.
yeah, the customers who turn in their tires pay a fee to have it appropriately dealt with, treated, which usually means in a lot of the industry, waste tires are used to provide crumb products that are used in another applications like for playgrounds or so on. So that's the expectation. When you're looking at that, the customer's thinking, I'm okay with that. I provide a few dollars or a few pounds. I'm happy to be contributing to sustainability because my tire is being taken and turned into something positive, right? Instead of being just burnt or trashed, right? But whereas one particular incident found that because I think it was partly volume driven, but I think partly just business driven, is that some of those tires that are collected under that, a lot of them end up in trash heaps. A lot of them end up being burnt either as just as fuel and so on. And that wasn't the real intent. So having that context of, especially when a consumer is paying an additional fee for an expectation of the end process being sustainable. I think having that context and making sure that that actually happens is important. So
Yeah, and
hopefully, I was trying to relate it to some of the real world things that are
it-
going on.
it's a very good example and very good case study because the expectations in sustainability are to improve the environment, to improve the social aspects, working conditions, and your example, and also to be a not only a recyclable process, but also part of a circular economy where we can recover most of the
Mhm.
components and return it into the process in a cost-effective manner. So all these points were actually, in your case, they were, not used really. So, Jacques, do you have any additional comments on this kind of, real life example on how standards end up to be disregarded and actually misused in the industry, in the supply chain?
Well, that's one of the things that you have to be very careful about, as Andy was mentioning, depending on waste and everything. Like I have a lot of experience recently with data centers, for example. And in data centers, there's a big metric that everybody's using that's called PUE, so the power usage effectiveness. You know, so basically, how much power are you using to power the servers versus the total, the total power of the data center divided by the power usage of the servers. So the closer you are to one, the better you are. Okay, but some data centers are using and most of the extra power is used by the cooling systems that cool everything, that because those servers are using, there's a lot of heat generated. But some of the data centers are reusing this heat to, warm up pool, to warm up greenhouses, to warm up all kinds of other equipment around it. So is it really waste now? Because you're saving the energy that is consumed by the other facility. So you always, it's never as simple as you may think. You always have to, there's another layer to it. So you have to really well define what the waste is at the end. Because as the example Andy was doing, if the waste is reused, then it's kind of an overall benefit for someone. If the waste is not reused, then that's a problem. Okay.
You brought a very good point point, let me bring it a little bit in sort of in the context of physics, right? Because if you don't work across the supply chain, actually you consider that cooling and the heat, from the servers are actually waste. But if you reuse it and if you use a supply chain, the supply chain says, no, I'm going to take this heat and heat homes and, as you said, swimming pools and so. It's a very good use case as well. And Andy, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just to emphasize some of this from a business perspective, and just tie in a couple of points together. It's all about risk, right? Lots of businesses, enterprise use risk for all sorts of aspects of their business. Financial risks, if I'm doing business overseas, how does interest rates impact my business, for example? Or if I'm providing loans, how does the economy impact my business? Or if I'm a cybersecurity provider, or a technical company, what cyber risks am I exposed to? What's the probability of those happening and so on? And lots of companies use risk management frameworks, either full enterprise for all the different aspects or specifically cybersecurity related. There are lots of different risk models and they tie together. But the point is, you can never completely eliminate every single risk, right? So you build your business and you operate it to maximize the value of your business, and that value may be expressed in terms of sales or operating costs or whatever. But you try and minimize risk to promote your business, having more value, but also to protect your business from external risks of being sued, for not meeting a particular regulation of one type or another. And the thing about this is companies are very used to operating around risk frameworks and making things better, continuous improvement through risk management. And to Jacques' great example of data centers, you start to see in the industry, there's a lot of concern about data centers and power consumption of data centers. And I think this has driven a mindset within the companies that provide data centers about how can we minimize that, right? And to Jacques' point, some of them have been very innovative, right? And started to use the excess power that they're using for other purposes of benefit to either the local industry, the local environment, or some other aspect. Because the bottom line is you need data centers. I mean, we've talked about AI and just the use of cloud computing, and AI is going to drive a lot of data centers. That's not going to go away. So there's going to be a lot more focus on how we make that more sustainable. So
I think what you're bringing there is
data centers is very good.
Yeah, I think what you're bringing there is actually the importance of SRFI as a tool to open a strategic description, right? Because swimming pools and data centers don't, or home heating and data centers don't come in the same sentence often, and they should, right? If you look from a sustainability viewpoint, you can discover horizontal, if you want, across industries, efficiency, because that's what you're talking about, efficiency of using energy, right? So we lose less we waste less back to the waste.
But what I was going to go on to say is when you look at risk, and as a cyber practitioner, I've been audited a lot of companies down my supply chain, but I've also been audited as well. And we all tend to agree on various risk management frameworks we're using, which particular standards of operations we're using. We're never, trying to get 100% on every exam down that chain is virtually impossible. So a lot of companies use risk to say, okay, if that's not covered by that particular supplier, what is my action plan now? Do I just accept that risk? Or do I completely eliminate it by moving to another supplier, right? Or are there some other compensating things I can do with that supplier to make that?
Sure, you can
That goes on,
insure
that
against risk.
I
You
was
can,
going to say that goes on all the time in
yeah,
business. And I see the same thing happening with the actionable ESG framework as well. Is
Yep.
that over time we'll develop that common taxonomy, language, context, transactions, and so on. And it'll become a very, very useful tool within your risk management framework or frameworks if you use several. If you use your own customized one. So, yeah, I think that's going to be a really important point.
Jacques, if you have to add, and I'll be going to a closing question, which is different, and really from your experience, what recommendations, if you have to add first to the risk part, but what would you advise people at the beginning of their careers, students and new grads that are choosing a career in sustainability based on today's conversation and our work together?
Well, I think sustainability is a hot item right now. Everybody talks about it. Everybody has different view on what they're implementing in a short-term basis, but everybody's implementing something. I've seen people that are just focused on their pretty much carbon footprint or even only the energy they're using themselves. I've seen people that are looking at even the construction cycle of their buildings and their facilities, people that are already planning for end of life of their equipment to see what's going to be recyclable or not. It depends on each industry, but it's a very, very wide scope. And not everybody is at the same level. Not every industry is at the same level. And that's something where there's going to be a lot of work for a newcomer into the industry to help, stay on top of what's happening everywhere, what are the leaders in the various aspects of it, and see what could be reused in your own industry, without having to change everything at once, because that's not necessarily feasible in an established company. But there's ways to start implementing things where you have a goal that you're going to reach in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and work towards that. And we've seen that with lots of companies right now that have put targets on some parts of sustainability for the next probably 25 years, depending on the industry. So if you're a newcomer industry, I would say just stay informed of whatever is evolving everywhere and see what's feasible in your own area.
Thank you. And Andy, the same question for you. What would you advise students and new grads entering the field of sustainability from the work we've done together?
I'm not sure I would advise them of anything. They could probably advise me better. No, but seriously, there's a serious point behind that. When you look at business generally, obviously, a lot of the population within a business has been many years, and people are humans and fall into comfort areas. Even the most innovative companies do have some very strict rules around how to operate, because at the end of the day, they're regulated businesses, right? So introducing new blood, new ideas has always been a strength of good companies, and nurturing those through. I think we're at an inflection point in that a lot of there's a lot more realization about the value of sustainability. And young students coming into businesses bring a better mindset around that. And I think we can cultivate that, right? Not try and overpower it, but cultivate and use those fresh ideas within the industry. The thing is how to do that, and without some actionable framework. I keep coming back to this. Having that actionable framework and having people work around that would be much more valuable than just saying, hey, you're new here, what's the idea? So let's try and do something new in no context whatsoever. So I think there's a good way of our younger populations getting much more involved and much more valuable, in terms of sustainability moving forward.
I think you both brought very important advice. One of them, learn more people disciplines, just be able to look up and down the supply chain and the value chain and find opportunities. And Andy, despite of not wanting to give advice, I think there is a very good nugget there, and learn how to build innovation on prior innovation, on prior work done by previous generation of innovators. As you said, companies go through an innovation cycle and the maturity cycle. And in a mature company, you need people with a mindset of innovators, but with the knowledge, as Jacques said, to be able to build on existing frameworks and existing standards. So with this, I would like to conclude and thank you for taking the time to visit with us today. I'd like to invite our audience to make sure that they tune in every week for a new episode of AKFI's Actionable ESG Talk series. As you see today, you'll gain new perspectives on how to mitigate risks and create value by integrating ESG and digital transformation and AI. Thank you again, Andy and Jacques, and I hope to see you soon again.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.